And we are now live.
Great, thank you, Leanne. Good morning. On behalf of CENIC, I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on broadband opportunities for California. I'd also like to welcome some of our colleagues from elsewhere in the country. My name's Louis Fox. I'm the president and CEO of CENIC, and we're really happy to have this session with some national leaders who can inform us about what I think is a historic moment now, where we will see both in the near term and in the longer term, more resources come to address broadband access and equity than we ever have in the history of the internet. So it's a very exciting moment. It's particularly important for organizations like CENIC as we focus on anchor institutions, our research institutions, our educational institutions, our libraries, healthcare, tribal communities, cultural and scientific organizations, the whole panoply of community anchor institutions. And with the experience of the pandemic, we also know that we have to be far more adept at reaching these communities at home. And many people lacked access to broadband, and therefore they lacked the continuity of education or research or healthcare or employment. So it's absolutely critical that we address both our constituents in their institutions and in their homes. I have the great pleasure of introducing briefly our three speakers. John Windhausen of Song and Legend. He leads the Shelby Coalition, and Shelby is made up of many of the community anchors that I recently mentioned. He really has been our eyes and ears and voice in Washington, D.C., and he's just been extraordinary, both during the pandemic and now with these historic pieces of legislation that have been enacted. Cathy Benham is, some of you may know that we run two very large E-rate consortiums in California, one for schools and one for libraries. And Cathy's our secret weapon. She has really helped us make sure that we see almost 100% success in the E-rate program on behalf of our constituents. And lastly, Kim Lewis. Kim is our state government liaison, our director of government relations. And as John is our eyes and ears in Washington, D.C., Kim does this for us in Sacramento, California. And with that, I will turn things over to John Windhausen.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Louis. It's a great pleasure to be with you and with everybody on this webinar. Let's see. Let me share my screen so my slides hopefully are visible now. So Louis, thank you for that very kind introduction and remarks. Yes, we serve very similar compatible communities when we talk about anchor institutions. That's why the Shelby Coalition was created 11 years ago, to be a voice for anchor institutions, and our voice and our membership has grown accordingly over the last few years, particularly this year, because it is so exciting what is happening to see this really broadband bonanza of legislation coming from the US Congress. And supplemented by a lot of state programs that are affecting broadband deployment and adoption. So we share the CENIC goals of connecting the anchor institutions to broadband, but also their surrounding communities, because we believe everybody deserves to have a high capacity and affordable broadband connection. But the anchor institutions can often be the key gateway to serving those residential consumers. So with that introduction of background about our Shelby Coalition and our unity of interests, I'll move forward here to the next slide. Let's see. How can I move to the next slide? Oh, there we go. So let's see, I think yes, there we go. So this is a quick review of some of the legislation that has already passed. And I've highlighted in yellow the appropriations from Congress that have been used for broadband. So some of this is a review, but just to set the groundwork, the CARES Act that passed last March by Congress had a variety of funding programs for state and local governments, and broadband was not specifically identified. There was no specific broadband program in the CARES Act, but broadband was considered an eligible use of that funding. And we have a couple of interns who did some research to gather information about how that money was actually spent. And they concluded that about $2 billion of that money was spent on different kinds of broadband, digital learning projects, devices, and mobile hotspots and the like. So that was certainly good. It was not enough funding to actually solve the digital divide or address the huge shortfall of broadband to the home, but it was a good start. And then in December, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act, allocating $3.2 billion to the FCC for this emergency broadband benefit program. Now, this is a program for low-income households, and it provides $50 a month subsidy for homes, $75 a month for tribal, and it includes $100 subsidy for home devices, so computers, tablets, and the like. It also created some NTIA broadband programs, which I'll come to in a minute. But the interesting thing about the legislative process is that last December, Congress was actively considering allocating several $1 billion to the E-rate program to facilitate online learning off campus. But the Republicans and the Democrats could not come to agreement last year on whether the funding should be actually go through E-rate or it should go as a separate standalone program. The Republicans did not want it to go through E-rate because they feared it would create an ongoing expectation that E-rate would pick up the tab on an ongoing basis. They agreed on the amount of money, they agreed on the purpose, but they couldn't agree on whether it should go through E-rate or as a separate standalone FCC program. So when those negotiations fell apart, they instead decided to turn their attention to this emergency broadband benefit program as kind of the fallback for low-income households. And that, everybody agreed, should be a separate program run by the FCC. And so that was good. It wasn't, exactly what we had hoped for, but then we kind of got what we hoped for in the next bill. The American Rescue Plan Act came along, now with a Democratic-controlled Senate and House, and we were able to get the E-rate funding too. So rather than having it be an either-or situation, we have the $3.2 billion for the emergency broadband benefit program that the FCC is administering right now. And the applications will be coming in for that program in about the next month. And then simultaneously, the FCC is going to be implementing this new $7.17 billion of new E-rate funding. So this is for, even though it says E-rate, it is intended to be used for off-campus use. So as we know, traditional E-rate funding is for on-campus. Category 1, bringing services to the school and library. Category 2, funding Wi-Fi equipment and routers inside the building. This is sort of like a category 3, where the FCC is going to be allocating $7 billion for off-campus use to connect households. So there's a little bit of overlap, I have to admit, between this new $7 billion E-rate funding and the $3.2 billion in the emergency broadband benefit, and we'll get to that. Also in the American Rescue Plan Act that passed in March, was kind of a new and exciting but uncertain benefit of an additional $10 billion to the US Treasury for capital projects directly enabling work, education, healthcare monitoring, including remote options. Now, the word broadband does not appear in that statutory language. Nonetheless, we are told by congressional staff that they have an agreement with the White House that this $10 billion is to go to broadband. And that was negotiated by Senate leaders and the White House as a part of that plan. They could not mention broadband specifically for jurisdictional reasons. That would have meant it would have to go to the authorizing committees in Congress to review that legislation and vote on it before it could be included in the bill. And they didn't have the time for that. So they carved out and this $10 billion, sent it to the US Treasury, which the Senate rules allowed them to do on an expedited basis. And really the reason that the senators were so focused on getting this $10 billion in sort of as a down payment, they realized there's more broadband funding in the works through an infrastructure bill, but they weren't sure whether that infrastructure bill is actually going to pass or not. And I'll come to that too later in my slides. But they got 10 billion, and that's certainly wonderful. It's a bit of a black box, as we'll see. And then on top of that, there's an additional $350 billion for state and local governments, some of which could be used for broadband, like the CARES Act funding. So we have several overlapping broadband funding programs that Congress has allocated, and it's all incredibly exciting, but it is a bit of a whirlwind trying to keep up with how all of these programs are going to sync up. So let's talk about the coronavirus, the $10 billion going to the US Treasury. The Treasury Department is going to issue the rules for how that funding, how you can apply for that funding within 60 days, which means on May 10th. But the money is actually going to be allocated to the states. And it's a complicated formula set out in the legislation that says that each state gets at least $100 million. And then there's additional appropriations to each state based upon their total population, their rural population, and their low-income population. So each state is going to get this money, and what's unclear is how much control the Treasury Department is going to have over how that funding is actually used. So, you know, some speculate that, well, the Treasury Department, being an arm of the executive branch, they will rely on NTIA, which has the broadband expertise. Perhaps NTIA will ghostwrite the rules for the Treasury Department to issue, and that will provide greater guidance by the Treasury Department about how that funding can be spent. So the Shelby Coalition submitted a letter to the Treasury Department where we indicated our priorities, of course, for anchor institutions, that they should be funded and provided multi-gigabit connectivity. We also supported middle mile investments as well as last mile investments. But unlike the FCC or other regulatory bodies, it's not a public proceeding. So we emailed the key staff person at the Treasury Department our letter. And we know that other organizations also submitted letters, but we don't know exactly how many there were, what kinds of advice they're getting. I emailed the Treasury Department official again, and all he could do was, yes, confirmed, I've received your letter. No feedback, no further conversation. We've asked for a meeting. I don't know whether we're going to get that meeting or not. So this is a bit of a black box process that the Treasury Department is going to be going through. And, you know, sympathies to them because they're not used to administering broadband programs. So we'll see what they do with this, but it's potentially very exciting. I also mentioned NTIA broadband programs. These were funded out of the Appropriations Act last December. And these programs are not getting the visibility that they really should have, partly because it's a lower dollar amount, but they could be very significant for certain core constituencies. So there was $285 million given to NTIA to provide broadband for HBCUs and other minority serving institutions. We've had a couple of good conversations with the officials at NTIA, and they really like the Shelby Coalition's philosophy of building broadband to and through the anchor institutions as a way to serve the surrounding community. In fact, they pointed to some language in the statute that, and in their public notice that talked about community institutions. They didn't quite use the word anchor institutions, but from our conversations with them, that's what they meant. So we're very excited about this. And as we understand it, HBCUs are more than just on-campus cauldrons of intellectual activity, but the HBCUs and other minority serving institutions are often promoters of economic growth in their community. And it's not just the on-campus use, but the off-campus use that is very significant for the surrounding areas. And so they really like the idea of providing fiber to the HBCU or the institution and then extending that through with wireless technologies off campus. So we think this could be a great program for, obviously for those communities that receive those grants, but also for the whole principle of extending broadband from the anchor institution to the residential consumers around them. There's also $300 million available for rural broadband partnerships, state and local partnerships with the private sector. So this is trying to pick up on that notion of public-private partnerships that's often discussed. This could be a great opportunity, or it could be rather limited. We don't know how this is going to work out. There's also $1 billion for tribal broadband, which is also very exciting. There's certainly a big need for tribal. I've talked to one tribal representative who said, well, that's great, but the need is probably many times more than $1 billion to bring tribal areas up to broadband speeds. And then the legislation also created 3 different offices within NTIA to govern the use of this funding, which is going to be interesting to see. Now, the minority broadband initiatives, they've already been working on that. So that is, in a sense, codifying what NTIA has already been doing. Same with the internet connectivity. The federal interagency coordination is, an interesting development. NTIA has already been leading an interagency working group for the last few years. But there is an effort being driven by some of the local telephone companies to try to promote greater government coordination. Now, on the surface, that sounds like, well, that sounds great. Why shouldn't they be coordinated? I have a fear, however, that they're trying to use this coordination process as a way for one agency to veto the funding decisions of another agency. So if that's the way this plays out, this could be very dangerous. And to add more specifics to this, the FCC is going through the RDOF process and it's awarding funding, but if they're getting funding from the RDOF, the telephone companies and broadband companies may go to NTIA and say, hey, you can't give out any more awards in that area because I'm already getting funding in this area. So we've seen this being used by the US Department of Agriculture as well, to say, we can't fund you because somebody else is already getting funding in that neighborhood. So if this coordination is really just a coordination, hey, supplementing and allowing agencies to converse and work together, then that's fine. But if it's used to try to disrupt the funding mechanisms and prevent alternative technologies, that could be dangerous. So we're going to be watching that closely on that. So I mentioned infrastructure legislation still to come. And with all of that broadband funding that's already passed, that may not be the biggest tranche of funding. President Biden just last week announced an infrastructure plan, a Jobs Act that calls for $100 billion in additional broadband funding. This could be incredible. It includes a focus on underserved areas, not just unserved areas. So we think that's a positive. development. So in other words, that would allow middle mile funding to be, middle mile projects to be funded. It also emphasizes the need for future-proof technology, which we also think is positive. So they're building for the long run, not in temporary fixes, but in long-term fixes. The Biden plan does not mention anchor institutions explicitly, which is a little bit disappointing, but the legislation does. We'll get to that. The Biden plan does recognize rural electric co-ops and municipal providers and other nonprofits like CENIC. So that's certainly a positive aspect of the Biden plan. And one of the most interesting things is that it does not support ongoing EBB subsidies. So this is an area that is a little confusing because the EBB program with that $3.2 billion, that may run out of money by this fall. And so the big question is, what do you do when that EBB money runs out of funding? Does the E-rate funding then become more important to fill that gap? Because the Biden plan does not call for ongoing subsidies. Now, but the interesting thing about the Biden plan is that it does say we need to keep prices affordable. And we want to include provisions to bring prices down for low-income consumers. But if it's ruling out subsidies, just raises the question, is the Biden administration looking at regulating the rates of broadband services for low-income consumers? That rate regulation possibility has been bandied about. That's kind of the ultimate fear of all the broadband companies. They don't want their broadband rates to be regulated. Is that what Biden's plan is suggesting? Well, they don't say that, but how do you guarantee lower rates if you're not providing a subsidy? It's a big open question. Now, the president announced that plan. He did not provide specific legislative language. So the job, even though it's called a Jobs Act, there's no specific statutory language that goes along with it. We suspect that the Clyburn-Klobuchar bill is probably the best vehicle to carry out the Biden infrastructure plan. So Mr. Clyburn, the majority whip in the House, introduced this bill last year, and Senator Klobuchar did as well last year. They have both reintroduced this bill in the current Congress. It's called the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act. It calls for $94 billion for broadband infrastructure, so pretty close to the $100 billion that President Biden has endorsed. It does call for multi-gigabit connections for schools and anchor institutions. So this is one of the things that we're very proud of, that the Shelby Coalition went in and spoke with Mr. Clyburn's staff and Senator Klobuchar's staff last year. They both agreed to include specific references to anchor institutions. So we're very pleased with that. We hope that that language stays throughout the process. And the Clyburn-Klobuchar bill includes the $2 billion more for the Emergency Connectivity Fund that Cathy's going to be talking about. And it includes $6 billion more for the EBB subsidies. So there's a little disconnect between the Biden plan and the Clyburn-Klobuchar bill when it comes to the EBB funding. So that will be something that we'll be watching as well. As to the prospects, will this infrastructure legislation get actually done? I think it will. I'm giving it a 60% chance of getting enacted this year. Obviously, the Republicans have raised quite a number of objections to the tax increases that Biden has proposed as a way to pay for the broadband bill. But the interesting position with the Republicans is that they're opposing taxes, but then if you, they say, but at the same time, they say it should be paid for, it shouldn't be deficit spending, but they don't support any particular way of raising that money. So it's not clear how the fund, whether there's enough Democratic support to pass these tax increases. In particular, the corporate tax rate would be increased from 21% to 28%. So that turns off the Republicans. Well, the key senator is Senator Manchin from West Virginia. moderate Democrat, and he's really kind of the key vote, given that it's a 50-50 split in the Senate, 51 if you count Vice President Harris. So they can't lose any Democrats. All the Democrats have to stay together. And Senator Manchin has already indicated some discomfort with the tax increases. So they may turn to other forms of revenue to try to pay for the broadband, and spectrum auction revenue has been cited recently as perhaps a way to pay for this broadband investment. The FCC's C-band auction that was held last year raised $80 billion from the private sector. So that's obviously pretty close to the $100 billion that is being proposed for broadband. So could they reallocate that $80 billion from the C-band auction to this purpose, and perhaps future auction revenues as well? I think there's a good chance of that. The Democrats are also likely to use the reconciliation process again to avoid the filibuster. And this was buttressed by a ruling by the Senate parliamentarian earlier this week, where the parliamentarian ruled that yes, indeed, the Democrats can use future reconciliation bills, actually more than one. The parliamentarian ruled the Congress could go back and amend the previous reconciliation bill to make changes to it, and that would still be permissible under the Senate rules. And that's, significant because you don't need 60 votes then, you only need 51 votes. The question, however, then becomes, if you're doing a reconciliation bill process, there's something called the Byrd Rule that says everything you put into that bill has to be directly related to either revenue raising or spending. So could that bill become the vehicle for other communications objectives, like fixing the broadband maps, fixing the universal service contribution mechanism? Rural healthcare funding should fall into that bailiwick because it is direct spending. But that is likely to be the best vehicle for not just the Biden plan, but because it becomes a vehicle, all sorts of opportunities might be available for adding additional measures if they can satisfy the budget rules that Congress has for reconciliation bills. I'll just mention here, and then I'll bring this to a close. The universal service contribution reform. I know this is a big issue in California. It's we are working on this on the federal level as well. The current contribution factor is really out of control. The fee to support all the 4 universal service funds is increased quite a bit. It's spiraling upwards now, 33%, likely to go higher to 40% in the near future. AT&T has suggested abandoning that funding mechanism and having all the appropriations go through Congress. We're not particularly a fan of that because what we really need the Universal Service Fund mechanism to be stable and predictable. Congress is anything but stable and predictable. So we much prefer the idea of having the FCC change the contribution formula to include broadband end user revenues, or BIAS service, broadband internet access service. If you were to include broadband revenues in the base, that could lower the contribution factor from 33% down to about 3%. So we think that would be a much more stable mechanism. It would cause less harm, less disparity, less discrimination. Question is it politically viable to assess a fee on broadband revenues? Well, the best way to address that is to try to get as big a coalition as possible together to try to, that would support this idea. So we don't have anything to announce on this yet, but I just wanted to alert you that Shelby is actively working on this. I am working on this actively with a big group of public interest groups and providers to see if we can come up with a suggestion for the FCC to fix the contribution mechanism later this year. So I'm running out of time, so I won't spend a lot of time on the RDOF. I know this is a big proceeding as well. We have a lot of concern about the reverse auction that the FCC used to award this funding in rural markets. The FCC estimated it would cost about $16 billion for this first round to cover 5 million households. But the bids went so low, only $9 billion was requested. And that raises some concerns for us that maybe these providers bid too low and they're not going to be able to make ends meet when it comes down to actually providing the service. So we're suggesting that the FCC take another look before it goes to the second round of RDOF auctions, which will actually cover many more. I mean, there's another 20 to 30 million households that still need to be connected, even after the round one connects the first 5 million. And there need to be better maps. And the current chairwoman, Rosa Morsel, has announced a new task force on broadband mapping. So we're hopeful that the better maps will produce better data and that will produce better quality broadband connections for these rural markets. So with that, I'll conclude. I just threw in this one slide here about the Shelby Coalition in case you haven't heard of us before, but we are a nonprofit advocacy organization. We're a membership organization as well. And we've had a real surge in members this year, about 40 new members. And correspondingly, we've increased the number of policy groups that we have within Shelby. So I've listed them there. If any of you on the webinar are interested in working with us, we would love to work with you. And you can follow up and let me know if you're interested. And there's my contact information. So with that, I'll close and be happy to answer any questions.
There is one question here, John, from Jim Warner. He's said that you'd mentioned hotspots at the beginning of your presentation, and he wanted to ask how well hotspots have done at meeting the needs of rural households for broadband.
Oh, well, you get a lot of different answers to that question based on your local area. We've had some schools tell us that they've worked great, and other schools that have told us it's been a disaster. In fact, there was one school that said they bought 20 hotspots and deployed them, and only 3 of them are being used. And that's because, I presume, because the cellular signal is just not strong enough to provide a high quality service. So that's why I know we're going to hear from Cathy about the ECF funding in just a minute, but the Shelby Coalition has said it should not be funding just for hotspots, that schools and libraries ought to have the opportunity to deploy other technologies that might be better suited to their rural markets.
Does anybody have any other, oh, hold on, there's another question. Take a look at this. Wayne asks, will there be any regulatory relief too? For example, can institutions provide wireless connectivity beyond the institution's physical borders?
Well, that is also a big question. Shelby is a strong supporter of doing just that. We think that schools are increasingly deploying CBRS and TV white spaces equipment to extend service off campus to the homes. But that's a big question in the rulemaking that the FCC is going through right now. We just filed our comments 2 days ago, and we listed about 20 examples of schools and libraries using wireless to extend service off campus. And we really want those deployments to be eligible for funding, because there are a lot of areas where there is no broadband service available. And so the schools and libraries might be best positioned to fill that need.
And another question around what technologies will the funding provide? And there's Starlink, there's a question there. I know that that's a mixed answer as well.
That is, you know, it is possible for Starlink to be eligible, I think. I'd be interested in Cathy's views, but it has to go through the school and library. So the school and library is going to be getting the funding. So they would have to have a bulk service agreement with Starlink, be able to fund that service for the consumer, I think. But it all depends on how the FCC rules come out, which we're expecting around May 10th.
I'd note, John, that in California, we're seeing some school districts deploy wireless meshes some fixed wireless, and LTE networks, depending, and they are simply not using the E-rate subsidy so that they can provide these services.
Yeah, I'm very impressed with how quickly these private LTE networks can be set up and implemented. It seems like it's become off-the-shelf technology that you can, that the telcos like to say, oh, well, network deployment, that takes too long, and this is an emergency. We need to get the funding out the door. But from what I'm seeing, you can deploy this technology in the matter of a few weeks, and provide emergency service, and it could get the funding available this summer, and then you'd be able to provide service by the time school comes back into session in September.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate the presentation. And let's turn to Cathy and some of the specifics of some of the other programs.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd also like to add to Lewis's comment, acknowledging the leadership of John Windhausen. He's just been a terrific advocate for our anchor institutions and for schools and libraries, and really has shown just tremendous leadership in advocating on behalf of us. So I just kudos to John. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on some of the programs that the FCC will be launching in the next couple of months in response to some of the legislative packages that have been passed by Congress in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Okay. So first, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, or EBB. This is the subsidy for low-income households, whereby Congress is allocating $3.2 billion to the FCC to allow for service providers to provide essentially a subsidy on broadband service to low-income households. And that subsidy is limited to $50, or it's up to $50 a month per service plan, $75 a month for families or households on tribal lands, and up to $100 benefit per device if the household contributes $10 to $50 for that device. And the devices, the FCC is looking at devices really that will help enable consumers to participate effectively in remote learning. So they are really looking to fund tablets and laptops and not phones. So that's a limitation under this plan. The plans are also going to be limited to a single plan and device per household. The funds, even though $3.2 billion is a lot of funding, there's concern that these funds will be tied up very quickly and potentially even as early as September, as John mentioned. The benefits will be administered very similar to the existing Lifeline program, where service providers will make available qualifying plans and will apply to the FCC for the benefit and then pass through that benefit to the qualifying household. And so hopefully and I think this may have been the intent behind the level of subsidy, is that hopefully there will be service providers will have plans that will essentially end up costing the households no monthly charge, so that hopefully that the monthly benefit will actually cover the full cost of that broadband service to those households. And again, it's administered through the service providers, similar to the Lifeline benefit, although the FCC is opening up participation to service providers beyond eligible telecommunications carriers. And this is really exciting. They opened an application window which closed at the end of March to allow broadband providers across the country that may not participate in the current Lifeline program, and allowed them to apply to participate in this program. And I think we're going to see a lot more rural providers and maybe some of the smaller providers participate and make this benefit available in more areas of the country than maybe the Lifeline benefit is available now. It is important to note that the providers have to opt in, so they're not required to provide this benefit. And the FCC last week announced its initial list of providers that will be participating in this program. There's a link on the slide deck, and I know this is going to be made available to the folks in the audience, that takes you to the FCC's website, which currently lists the providers by state, both whether they're cellular providers, if they're fixed landline providers, and if they are going to offer the subsidy for the device. And I have to be honest, when the FCC announced this last week, the selection of providers was pretty slim, but they have been adding additional providers since last week, including some of the larger telecommunications carriers, as well as small rural providers. And currently in California, I know we have a national audience. Currently in California, there are 32 providers, and of which 6 will be providing the device benefit. So the FCC also expanded the eligibility requirements for households that may qualify for this benefit. In addition to those that qualify for the existing Lifeline program, which is typically driven by eligibility through federal subsidy programs like Medicaid and SNAP, they have expanded it to households that may have children that participate in the National School Lunch Program, if they participated either in the current school year or in the previous school years. And then those that participate in the Community Eligibility Program, where 100% of the students receive free or reduced lunch. Every student on those campuses, their household would qualify for this benefit. It also applies for any households where a student may have received a federal Pell Grant, and also households that have experienced loss of income. And so these really have broadened the scope of the EBB benefit beyond the current Lifeline program. And then finally, if some providers currently already offer subsidized or low cost broadband solutions for low-income consumers, and if the providers that are going to participate in EBB already offer that, then they will make those plans eligible for this program as well. So we're looking to see this program to launch later this month. Currently, there is not a consumer forward-facing platform where consumers can go and sign up for the program, but I anticipate that that will probably go live at the end of the month. The FCC is looking for community outreach partners. If you go to the FCC's EBB homepage, you can sign up to receive updates, and they will reach out to you to provide additional information as more information is made available about this program. And we are looking, as far as the timeline, the program is slated to end 6 months after the COVID-19 public health emergency has been declared over, or until the funds are exhausted. So again, the concern is, will those funds be exhausted, or will there be an additional appropriation through the pending Clyburn-Klobuchar bill? Okay, and now I'm going to segue to the E-rate program. And I know that we have some organizations, some higher ed organizations on the webinar today. And I just want to remind folks that the E-rate program is geared towards K through 12 schools, primary and secondary schools. So funding is not available for higher ed institutions currently under the E-rate program. And then also libraries qualify. So when we look at just the traditional E-rate program and what activities have happened at the FCC since the start of the pandemic, there really wasn't a whole lot of relief provided during Chairman Pai's tenure. Unfortunately, even though organizations like Shelby have been advocating in DC to use E-rate funds to help connect students and library patrons during the pandemic, really the FCC had not taken a lot of action until just recently. So, you know, prior to earlier this year, the FCC had provided a waiver of the gift rules, which would allow service providers to offer schools and libraries free or heavily discounted broadband services to help connect students and library patrons while schools and libraries are closed. But beyond that, there were no additional steps as far as funding being made available through the E-rate program to help schools and libraries during the pandemic. However, things have changed in the last couple of months. I do want to mention that there is currently a couple of petitions at the FCC to either relax rules in the current E-rate program to help schools and libraries to be successful in connecting and providing high-speed broadband to their constituents. One of the petitions is from the Consortium of School Networking, or COSN, who has filed a petition with the FCC to request that they allow funding to be made available for cybersecurity, advanced cybersecurity, and make that a permanent change under the traditional E-rate program to allow that to be funded. We are still waiting to see if the FCC is going to take that up and ask for comment on that and do a rulemaking process. And the second piece, and I want to set the stage as far as how this comes into play with some of the changes that we are going to be seeing in the next couple months, is the Shelby remote learning petition. And prior to the new administration in Washington, there really was a lot of pushback from the FCC as far as their ability to make the E-rate program available to support anywhere, anytime learning or broadband access off of a school or library campus. And the Chairman Pai, the former chairman of the FCC, really held firm that the FCC did not have the statutory authority to allow for E-rate funded services to be used off of a school or library's campus. And so unfortunately, that just really kind of tied the hands of the FCC previously. However, now we have new leadership at the FCC. We have acting chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel, who has been a very public advocate for closing the homework gap. And in January, Shelby, with John's leadership and other organizations, did file a petition with the FCC to request that the FCC look again at this issue and really look at ways to help schools and libraries to provide access to their constituents while schools are closed and while libraries are closed. So a couple of things that Shelby asked was, first of all, for those organizations that are doing these creative measures where they are implementing either LTE solutions or other solutions where they are broadcasting their internet beyond the property line, don't penalize them for doing that. Waive the current rules which restrict use of E-rate funding for any services to a school or library's property. That's still a key area that we're hoping that the FCC will provide relief on. Also declare use of broadband services off of a school or library's campus. If they're being used for education, for remote learning, then it is an educational purpose and it should be funded through the E-rate program. And then finally, to open an additional window for schools and libraries to be able to request funding using the excess reserves that are available under the E-rate program cap. So based on this petition, the FCC opened a public comment period in the month of February, And there was a tremendous amount of positive comments, both from the stakeholder communities, as well as, surprisingly, the industry groups and major companies commenting that use of E-rate funds to support off-campus broadband connectivity, particularly during the pandemic, is an appropriate use of E-rate funds. So that comment period closed at the end of February, and that really sets the stage for this now new program that we will be having, that is coming to bear right now, which John mentioned, which is the Emergency Connectivity Fund. And so this is a separate allocation that Congress made that is going to be administered through the E-rate program, but really is not the E-rate program. It's a separate allocation, separate from universal service. So I would think we want to make that clear, because some of the questions that we are contemplating now is, how can this be effective like E-rate, but maybe not as complicated as E-rate? So when we look at the actual language in the statute that was passed, it has some specifics as far as what will be eligible under this new fund. And again, the focus is for funding broadband access away from a school or library location. And when we talk about schools, again, we're talking about K-12 schools, primary and secondary schools. The advanced telecommunications and information services, otherwise known in layman's term, broadband services to those locations, equipment such as Wi-Fi hotspots, modems, and routers, and surprisingly, or in addition to that, laptops and tablets, so devices that are necessary for students and library patrons to access the internet, are also eligible under this fund. And I think those of you that participate in E-rate know that end user devices have never been eligible for E-rate, but they are eligible under this fund. The statute states that the costs for these services should be reimbursed 100%. So there's no direct link to the E-rate discount mechanism that currently is in place, which requires a match, or essentially each of the schools and libraries to contribute a share of the cost. And these funds can be made available for reimbursement going back as far as January 27th of 2020 through June 30th, 1 year after the pandemic is essentially declared over, although the appropriation is going to be open through 2030. So that is pretty interesting. That it raises some questions as to there potentially might be some level of longevity, even though this is an emergency fund, but the funding itself is going to be made available through 2030. So I think that's pretty interesting. And ultimately, the program itself will be administered by the current administrator of the E-rate program, which is USAC, because most schools and libraries are familiar with the E-rate program. They participate currently with the E-rate program. And so I believe Congress felt that this is just a no-brainer to make this new fund be available through the existing existing structure of the current E-rate program. So the FCC is in a rulemaking process right now. They did publish a public notice because they have a very short amount of time to create the rules for this program. They only have 60 days. So we think May 10th, 11th is when they will announce the rules for this program. Their initial comments were due to the FCC by April 5th. Reply comments are due April 23rd. If you're interested in submitting comments, we always recommend that stakeholders submit comments. There is a link in the slide deck to the public notice and to the comments that have been submitted. You can see Shelby's great comments. And if you want to weigh in on this process, we really recommend that you do that. So some of the big questions that we have about ECF is, how will the FCC prioritize distribution of funds? $7.17 billion is a lot of funding, but there's a concern that the demand is going to be well above that. So how will the FCC prioritize how they will distribute those funds? Will this new program be as complicated as E-rate? And gosh, we sure hope it isn't. We want these funds to be pushed out as quickly as possible to schools and libraries that need this as quickly as they can. So we hope that that there will not be all of the myriad esoteric rules that there are with the current E-rate program, that the FCC and USAC will make it pretty straightforward. Will the FCC allow schools and libraries to fund innovative solutions to connect their students? There is a concern that the FCC would limit the eligibility of services to current run-of-the-mill cellular broadband services or landline services, and not allow some of the creative solutions like the LTE networks that Louis and John talked about, that they wouldn't allow these to be funded under this program. And we sure hope that that's not the case, that the FCC will take a broader interpretation to what services and equipment are eligible, and to allow schools that are looking at innovative ways to connect schools and libraries to connect their constituents, that these projects will be funded under this program. And then how far will the FCC go? Any new rules are going to have to be approved by at least a three majority, and right now we have a 2-2 split at the FCC, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. So how much push-pull will there be in the development of these rules, and will the FCC really open this up to be a much more flexible program? So just in closing, there have been a couple of notable proposals that have been submitted as far as what the FCC should do with these funds. One very popular proposal, or it's actually been supported by multiple groups, maybe in different aspects, is to do funding allocations that are similar to the current Category 2 mechanism, meaning that every school and every library would know exactly how much funding that they would qualify for based on some formula. And based on that formula, they would have a certain allocation that they can use for these services. That way there's more certainty, there's more equitable distribution across the country, more schools and libraries will qualify for these funds. Overwhelmingly, folks are saying cut the red tape, don't make this complicated, get these funds out quickly, and then finally provide the maximum flexibility so that schools and libraries can make the good choices on how they can use these funds effectively. Don't essentially make things too complicated or too limited so that schools are going to be, and libraries will be cut out of the process. So we likely, again, will see the rules probably mid-month next May, and then there will likely be application windows opened by USAC over the summer. So stay tuned. We will have more information in the next few months.
Thank you, Cathy. We have several questions, but what I'm going to suggest is that we have Kim present, and then we return to the questions on E-rate and any state programs. For the participants in this webinar, I also wanted to note that we are recording the session. We'll make the URL available. We'll send you an email, but we'll also make it available on our website, and the slides will also be available on our website, and we'll send a note out to participants as well. So with that, we'll turn to Kim Lewis to talk a little bit about what's going on in the California legislature that's related to broadband.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. And thank you to Cathy and John for setting kind of the context of what's happening at the federal level. And so I can talk a little bit about what's happening here in California. You know, for all of you who are here today, you know, I would assume you're very familiar with CENIC, and we are very important to the broadband ecosystem in the state and connecting points of presence within all 58 counties of California. Our governor Newsom was actually very committed to broadband, even talking about having broadband for all as early as November of 2019 before the pandemic started. And then when the pandemic hit, we saw, I think overnight, everyday Californians becoming critically aware of the value of broadband, not only for education, research, but economic development, telehealth, and a lot of our communities. And the governor also then issued an executive order tasking what we have as the California Broadband Council to focus on what are the action plans that state agencies can be taking to really start moving the needle on this issue. And then when our new legislative session came together in the fall, December of 2020, the Senate's leader, Tony Atkins, stated that, broadband was going to be one of the top 4 priorities that the legislature was going to tackle this year. And so it's really exciting to see this continued commitment amongst our legislative leaders around the notion of broadband. And to date, there's been over 35 bills that have been introduced thus far, talking about broadband in some form or another. I won't obviously get into the weeds on all of them. I do want to kind of talk with the group about kind of the general themes of what we're seeing being discussed in California and how these may impact our members here. First and foremost, I think there's a theme around bond funding. This is something very familiar where we've done a lot around maybe school facility bonds. That should be very familiar for our segments. But there's actually a broadband bond being considered before the legislature by Assemblymember Merritt Suchi. It's a $10 billion dollar proposal that they want to have administered by our Department of Technology. The language in the proposal actually calls out anchor institutions, which I saw one of the questions come in about what are anchors. And I think, for the most part, we all define them as our educational entities, public schools, community colleges, universities, libraries, but also a lot of folks consider our hospitals, health clinics as part of the mix, some of our cultural institutions, local government offices, public safety, municipal offices, depending on kind of what that definition looks like in some of the communities. This one is taking a very broad statement as basically public facilities for the most part. However, to be eligible under this program, you're really only looking at anchors that have no or inadequate broadband access and could financially support broadband service for 5 years. And I think that potentially poses a challenge for many anchors in California that are connected through CENIC and have some form of broadband access already. But we do know that there are many without, and those are definitely the hardest to serve. Back to kind of more of your traditional approach to broadband and bonds, we have our facility bills that are being considered. One by Mr. O'Donnell, who has not at this moment put in a dollar figure about how much they're looking at to fund for our K through 14 facilities at the moment. And then Mr. Glazer, who's looking at $15 billion with $9 billion in funding being directed towards our preschool, K-12, and community college, and then $2 billion for community colleges, CSU, and UC respectively. What was interesting is in 2020 in March, just before the pandemic hit, Prop 13, which was kind of the first school bond that actually failed in the state of California for the first time. And so we're trying to revisit the conversation. 75 is very similar, but slightly different than that original bond that failed. But, I think that changes, some of the conversations with voters around what are they looking for? And the unique thing about these two bills is this is like kind of the first time they're talking about allowing using the funds to support broadband infrastructure on the facility site. So within your school campus, what is the internal networking that's needed and can be used with these bond dollars? And finally, there's been a lot of talk around how do we lower the threshold for local governments, special districts, and the such to be able to pursue getting broadband funding for their local communities. And ACA 1 has been reintroduced again by Aguiar Curry, who's a big broadband proponent in California, to try and tackle this by lowering the voter threshold, because it's currently very high in our state, 2/3 vote, which makes it a little bit more challenging. This proposal did not pass last year, but she's added again because it is of much importance to her. Similarly, California has its own set of public purpose programs, similar to what occurs at the federal level from the Universal Service Funds. And the California Advanced Services Fund is kind of probably one of the bigger known public purpose programs that we have, which really focuses on infrastructure in the state. It does have some special sub-accounts in it around regional consortia that people may be familiar with, public housing, and an adoption program. But really the infrastructure component is what's most of interest and where majority of the funding goes. Towards the end of the session last year, there was trying to get some revamping and some changes to this program done by both Aguiar Curry and Senator Gonzalez, but it did not get through the finish line. And both members are committed to this issue and have reintroduced similar bills to what they had last year, but have at this point come together and said that whatever passes this year, they are going to be working together and collaborating on the proposals. For the community's interest, I would say SB4, my understanding is most mirrors the negotiated deal between the legislature and the governor's office about where the negotiations ended at the end of session. 14 is more closely aligned with Aguiar Curry's bill the previous year, and actually talked about funding middle mile again, funding rural internet exchange points. I know something that we have talked about as a community that could be ways to help resolve some of the connectivity challenges in rural California. The other two bills that look to modify this program, I note only because they are Republican members who obviously represent usually underserved areas of California. And there is a keen commitment to see these programs continued and to make some of the rules a little bit easier for participants to participate and actually see programs get funded and be successful. So we'll see what happens around this. If the fund is not continued this year and there's no legislation enacted, it will go away in the sense of the surcharge is no longer to be able to be collected. So I do anticipate there will be some legislation that gets resolved this year and is signed so that the fund is continued beyond the end of this year. Similarly, some of the other public purpose programs administered by our Public Utilities Commission, have different audiences. Some of our members are familiar with the California Teleconnect Fund, which helps to support the ongoing monthly charges for telecommunications. We have talked for a long time about, whether we could have a broadband lifeline program in this state and do something similar to there. And that is what is being proposed by Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia through his California Connect Fund. The legislation right now is a little light because, again, we're still early in our legislative session, but at the moment, criteria for the program, he's looking at low income qualifications or student qualifications. So students in K through community college could be eligible to access the subsidy program should it be created. The Public Utilities Commission would have to open a rulemaking, get rules, and get it all stood up no later than January 1 of 2023. The Ramos Bill 1128 takes a look at expanding our existing fund that supports carriers of last resort communities where they're providing basic local telephone service and asking them to expand their ability to fund broadband internet access in those regions. So that could be really exciting for many of our rural constituents where there is not a lot of infrastructure out there and they are high cost areas of the state in order to serve. For those who might have been familiar with our DIVCA, the Digital Infrastructure and Video Competition Act in the early 2000s, Senator Caballero is looking at trying to revisit the issue and revamp the program to really focus more on rural broadband deployment and ensure that communities across the state have access, and that folks who have video and cable franchising agreements are serving everyone in their territory with the goal of 100% broadband access. This one I think should be an interesting conversation to be had. The original bill was very controversial in Sacramento back in 2005, I want to say, but you know, it's up for discussion because the challenge for California is we have such a diverse landscape, and it really reflects, I think, the rest of the United States, where we have very mountainous regions to flatlands and to coastal regions. So, you know, it's unclear where these will land, but it is exciting to see that there is interest in doing some of the proposals we've talked about in prior years and seeing them come to fruition. And of no surprise, probably to everyone, you know, distance learning and adoption programs are also of interest to legislators in Sacramento, and figuring out ways to create programs to support students, particularly for our K through 12 community. We've got, you know, AB 1560, which is actually up in Assembly Education this morning. That bill, as well as the Bradford bill on here, are both being sponsored by the Cable Association, the California Cable and Telecommunications Association, of trying to come up with ways to ensure that there is more information going out to those who lack access at home. The daily bill would really have the Department of Education set standards for computing devices and distance learning, and then contingent upon some funding in the budget would allow the Department of Education to be able to support students who don't have access at those minimum standards. It would also allow for the Department of Technology to enter into sponsored service agreements where they could pre-negotiate service contracts with providers to be able to serve school districts locally. The Bates proposal is an interesting, big, comprehensive bill of a lot of things all in one, really trying to create a voucher program with an unspecified amount of funding at the moment to be able to allow students to purchase broadband service or hardware and devices, as well as provide $10 billion to our Public Utilities Commission to do its own reverse auction. So that would be an interesting proposal should that move forward. Maybe a little bit less unlikely given that it is a Republican member who is pushing it, but very exciting to see that they are looking to come up with innovative and creative solutions. The Becker proposal is a similar one to things I think we've seen in the past of really trying to put funding into K through 12 communities, whether it's through like the 11 regions of the successor regions in the state to fund education technology, to support local school districts, to advance their distance learning, technology training and supports. And then the Bradford bill is really to grow adoption programs in our public housing through the Housing and Community Development Department, which is where all of our public affordable housing programs are run. So they're the ones who fund all the grants around multifamily housing projects, affordable housing projects. So I think that's kind of a nice complementary proposal to support growing those obviously low income housing developments. Not surprising as well is that there are a ton of bills, and I'm not going to talk about it, but every single one of them, but just to give you a sense that permitting and infrastructure deployment is clearly another big burden and hurdle for our companies to be able to deploy broadband. There's a lot of focus on pole attachments. How do we streamline access to it? Are we following the rules that the FCC adopted in their orders? And we have some providers who do micro-trenching, and that's sometimes a challenge for local governments to be able to understand and develop rules around micro-trenching. And how do we ensure that applications are treated in the same manner. Same thing with some small cell. That's been previous issues that we have talked about in the past. And so this is a big focus for the community in order to really move forward on getting broadband deployment. The local government and permitting process is a big part of that conversation. So that's kind of I give you a good flavor of what is happening when it comes to legislation being considered. This year, we have a 2-year cycle. So bills that maybe don't move this year because we are operating in a distance learning environment in the sense of, as well as for legislation. So members have been asked to only move 12 bills forward from their original house to their second house. That'll be interesting. So to see what members prioritize to move. But we also have a state budget process that we do on an annual basis. The governor introduced his budget by the January 10th statutory constitutional deadline and noted that he would be leaning on the legislature for their guidance around what did they want to prioritize for broadband funding and broadband projects. We have kind of a really interesting outlook since January. We've had a bunch of stimulus stuff that, Cathy and John talked about. There was, even the budget did not include any of the December stimulus funding. So we've got, that was not reflected in our budget. The, American Rescue Plan has not been accounted for. And then when we look at our state's cash position, we are trending 10 billions upwards above where our estimates were when we adopted our budget last June. So we made some really significant fiscal cutbacks last year, deferrals for a lot of our school districts in the billions. We've had kind of a really crazy budget process this year where we have done some immediate action, some early action, and then our normal budgetary process actions. So most of our budgets subcommittee hearings have already occurred thus far. That's not normal. Normally that would be happening simultaneously, but given the restrictions around the amount of hearings that can happen at one time in Sacramento, we tried to get all those out of the way early. So now we're in policy committees. And then we have a May revise where the governor will put forward a new budget based on what was supposed to be April tax receipts. Now that we have pushed the tax deadlines out into May, and that'll also make things a little interesting around here in terms of what that budget really looks like. But again, as I noted, we've got, all this stimulus funding that wasn't accounted for previously. So in theory, we should have a really good budget situation that we're looking at. And it's a good opportunity for one-time funds. Just as the federal funding was really looking at infrastructure and growing broadband, I think there are a lot of opportunities for that as well. And, the state has an obligation to pass a balanced budget by June 15th. So I anticipate that we will have something adopted and the governor will get it signed in time before our July 1 fiscal year starts. But kind of what's happened and trended over the last couple of years is we do some of our trailer bill or policy bills that go along with our budget, and those will happen continuously from June, July, and August until the end of our session. Just as, we do budget bill juniors, when we kind of get a better sense of fiscal revenues from tax increases, from the tax receipts, we'll have a different perspective of where we're at. And so I think, it's a really exciting and crazy time, and things are very dynamic in Sacramento and things are changing every day. Just given our fiscal picture, I think that's very consistent of what's been happening at the federal level. And so I'll just kind of stop there because I know we wanted to allow some time for questions at the end. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk with you guys this morning.
Thank you, Kim. We do have some questions. I did want to note that a number of participants have asked if we would be doing a follow-on session. And I think as we have more clarity about both the rules around legislation that's been enacted, as well as where we're headed with legislation that's in process, we will schedule another one of these sessions. So stay tuned. For Cathy or John, a couple of questions about EBB. First question was, can providers still sign up for the EBB program, or did the application process end in March?
My understanding is that the application deadline was March 22nd. I did go to the, I did see the question, so I did go to the FCC website. I do see that they have, the FCC is processing these initial applications for non-eligible telecommunications carriers, and they still have the link to the application. So I would say if you're interested, that you may want to just go ahead and try to submit an application to see if you can get some traction with the FCC at this point in time.
From the perspective of a household, it sounds, one question is, it sounds like individual households will generally need to use the Lifeline National Verifier system. Do either of you have any sense that there'll be alternative methods for signing up? For instance, the questioner noted that could a university, for instance, provide group registration for Pell recipients?
I think that's a great question. I am not familiar yet if there is a way to do bulk registration for this program. I know that there are providers that are working with organizations to do with NDA, so they sign non-disclosure agreements with the providers to provide household information to the providers that will be participating in the program. So it's a direct organization to provider relationship where those details are reported. But I'm not aware of a sort of national compository where they would take that information as of yet.
Thank you, Cathy. For John, one question is, under the American Rescue Plan Act, what actually constitutes broadband? What are the speeds that we're talking about?
So the legislation does not change the broadband standard that the FCC has adopted. So the current FCC definition of broadband is 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up. And that is not changed. The FCC did ask the question, should it change the standard in implementing the Emergency Connectivity Fund E-rate dollars? And to be honest, Shelby suggested there's no need to change the standard, but you ought to encourage providers to offer more than that, a higher level of bandwidth. But also in some areas where there may not be any bandwidth, you'd be lucky to get 25.3. So we don't think that it should, like if you can't get 25.3 and all you can get is 10.1, then, and that's the only thing available, then you should fund that to get those customers connected. I will say in the new broadband legislation that has been proposed by Mr. Clyburn and Senator Klobuchar, they're proposing to raise the broadband standard to 100/100. So that would be a significant increase, obviously, over the 25.3 standard that's there today. And then for anchor institutions, the bill would increase it to gigabit speeds. And that would be the goal of that legislation, to fund broadband at that higher level, which we really strongly support.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, John. One question came in about, and this is more a CENIC specific question, about whether we would use our E-rate consultants to help districts with the ECF program, even though it's not considered E-rate. And that's something that we will need to have a conversation about, both with the CENIC board and with our consultants. So to be determined, but we will certainly keep you informed about how we're going to proceed. There have been a couple of questions about the Treasury program, and I guess, you know, we all have questions about it because it is a black box. But maybe, John, perhaps you'd like to opine from a Shelby point of view. Some folks have asked about whether other kinds of community anchor institutions might fit in here. For instance, scientific and cultural institutions that may not be directly parts of universities, but they may be affiliated with them, or astronomical observatories, environmental monitoring stations, and so on.
Well, that certainly would be a good idea. The problem is we have no idea, and I don't think anybody has any idea how the U.S. Treasury program is going to operate and what their rules are going to be, because they haven't come out and said anything. We, in our comments, in our letter we wrote to the Treasury Department, we did suggest that a very broad definition of anchor institutions should include all kinds of entities and not just the traditional schools, libraries, and healthcare providers. And so we think the Clyburn legislation also incorporates a very broad definition of anchor institution as well. So if Treasury looks around to see what other proposals, how they have defined an anchor institution, we think they could find some very broad definitions. And let's hope that they incorporate those, because frankly, the Treasury Department probably doesn't have the expertise itself in-house, so it needs to rely upon other parties. And we're hoping Shelby is one of the parties that they look to for that kind of definition.
We're all hoping that that's the case. We certainly hope that they appreciate the expertise that you and the broad Shelby community has been providing. Another questioner, and it was more of a point being made, noted that while disenfranchised communities are clearly, for reasons of instruction, certainly the important community to address, there are also needs that folks who are involved in research, and this includes students at home as well, they have needs, and often they need gigabit speeds at home in order to continue their studies and their research. And so that was just just from a personal perspective, in the Bay Area here, many of us have gigabit symmetrical speeds in our homes and are using that. And it seems in some ways a bit ironic that all of a sudden gigabit speeds to an institution that has hundreds, if not thousands of students, a single gigabit is considered adequate when the marketplace is rapidly changing, particularly in urban areas. So any thoughts about that, John?
Well, I will have to admit, I have gigabit capacity to my home office and I love it. It's great. I'm the only one I know that doesn't have connectivity problems. So I think that should be the standard that we should be aspiring to. And I think, we've got sort of the short-term coronavirus situation where we need to get students connected right away, as soon as possible, because school is closed and they need not just homework, but they need to be able to attend school during the day. So we've got both that short-term emergency need where we ought to get them whatever we can get to them as quickly as possible. But what I like about the Biden plan, about the Clyburn bill, is that is projecting a much higher speed, and actually it's calling for multi-gigabit connections to anchor institutions in the future. The Biden plan talks about future-proof technology. So I really like the fact that the Biden plan and the Clyburn bill are looking toward building long-term infrastructure. And I did take another look at the legislation, the talking points, and they are talking about having 75%, the bulk of the $100 billion, $80 billion is going to specifically to broadband build out. And that's where they're encouraging the 100 by 100 schemes. 75% of that funding will be awarded by the FCC through a competitive bidding process. The other 25% is going to be given to the states for them to deploy using a competitive bidding process. So hopefully through both the federal efforts and the state efforts and this Treasury funding of $10 billion, we'll be able to solve this problem in the next 4 or 5 years.
Well, thank you, John. And many thanks to you and to Cathy and to Kim for a really informative session. As I mentioned earlier, we will hope to have a follow-up session sometime later in the spring when we have greater clarity about existing and prospective legislation. And thanks to all of you who participated in this webinar and took time out of your day. Hope the rest of your day is good. Thank you.
Thank you.